Hey everyone, welcome to the Bay Area Content Marketing Meetup. Today we're talking about engaging your online community. Let me introduce our presenter. Carrie Melissa Jones is an author, community builder, and researcher of online communities. Her work has influenced the world's leading online brand communities, including the American Medical Association, Patreon, Google, and 2 US presidential campaigns. Today we're giving away 5 copies of Carrie's book, Building Brand Communities, How Organizations Succeed by Creating Belonging, which Carrie co-wrote with Charles Vogel. Carrie, thanks for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm actually in Wisconsin, so I might be the only person on Central Time right now. And Dennis and I did not coordinate our shirt colors, but it worked out very nicely. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about just some basic information about building online communities. The book goes very, very in depth, but I'm trying to keep today's talk fairly short so that you can ask questions because there's so many similarities between communities in terms of the architecture and what needs to get built, but everyone's community is unique. So I really want to make sure that I share some broad information and then you can ask specific questions. So just by a show of hands, how many of you have an online community that you're running right now? Okay, and those who are not on camera, you can ish, Jim. Okay, so about half of you, and the rest of you, you can just type in the chat if you'd like what drew you to this particular talk, or what interests you about online communities. Maybe you're starting one soon and you're trying to get prepared to run one, just so I can make sure I'm speaking to all of you. Okay, launching soon. Okay, so we've got a number of people pivoting. Yep. Okay, so we'll be talking about getting you set up from scratch in the right way then. And then also for those of you who are leading online communities already, we'll talk about what you might do to make them even more effective. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about engaging your online community. Now this word engagement, just like the word community itself, is hotly debated. It means many things to many different people. I was actually just in a course yesterday, and I asked the class to define participation and engagement, and half of the people in the course, including my professor, actually defined it that participation was active involvement, people actually posting, and that engagement was you could be lurking, you could be posting, you could be doing anything, and then the other half believed the exact opposite thing. So it is completely fine that we all have different definitions, but I want you to know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about engagement, because it's really important for thinking about how to create better interactions, better relationships online. So if you're struggling with engaging your online community today, or if you're worried about engaging your online community, you're not alone. This is one of the top fears and questions that I deal with all the time is, how do I get more engagement? So as Dennis said, I'm not going to go through my whole bio here. The only thing I will add is that in addition to my work, I also research and teach about communication and online communities. And so a lot of my work is really based on my intuition and my experience over many years, but then the research that's been going on in the field over the last 20 plus years as well. And because this is such a short talk, I'm actually only going to be talking for about 15, 20 minutes about the actual content. I welcome you to turn off your phone, close any other tabs, and get rid of any distractions, because I know how tempting it can be to be on a Zoom meetup or any other kind of Zoom event and be doing 15 other things, or even just one other thing. So just, I invite you to be here now fully, if you can be. So let's get to it. I would love to hear from you in the chat if you have ever posted something in an online community, gotten 0 response, and then deleted your post. I know that I have. I think I just did this about last week-ish in my own community. Yes. Yes. So More than once, of course, yes. This is completely normal, like I said, and this is it's even for someone like me who's been doing this for many years, is just part and parcel with actually creating something that's meaningful. So I'm curious if any of these following statements sound like you, just so I can get an understanding of what some of your issues, concerns, and fears are around online community engagement. So I'm going to read 3 different statements, and you can type in the chat if it's 1, 2, or 3. And also, if you don't yet have an online community, say which one you're most afraid of being you. So number 1, I spend hours thinking of the perfect thing to say, and only the same 3 people respond every time. I will tell you this is actually a good initial sign and a firm starting ground. So if this is you, this is actually a good indication of things to come. 2, if I don't create something new every day, my community is either filled with the same questions over and over, or nothing but crickets. So you feel a strong burden to be in your community 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or else nothing will happen. Or 3, we have tons of activity, but I'm overwhelmed and unsure if the activity can be considered valuable engagement. So sometimes seeing activity is not the issue for community builders, but seeing the right activity and knowing if the activity that you're actually producing is having any impact on your organization, on members' lives in general. So let's see, we've got 1s, some 2s. Okay. Yeah, lots of crickets, as well as spending hours and hours thinking of the right thing to say. So I know that you're all here because you want to create a thriving online community without randomly thinking of things and posting them, second guessing yourself, or feeling overwhelmed. And you want to feel an integrity and that you are capable and purposeful, and that your position in the community that you're building is sustainable and making a difference. And that's really at the core of community engagement, not the numbers, the vanity metrics. It's about servicing people and helping them find their place in the community and the people that can help them make progress. So today's very, very, very specific focus is defining meaningful engagement in online communities. So as I said, the word engagement means many, many things. I use the term meaningful engagement to be a stand-in for what we actually want to be creating, not just more crap on the internet, but meaningful things happening that can actually impact the world for the better. So just to give you some context for how I got to this word and this term in general, for many years, I was simply chasing these vanity metrics, more posts, more page views, things like that. And actually 8 years ago, I was taking very moody Instagram photos like this one in San Francisco outside of the Hotel Utah. This was right by my office that I worked at. I worked at a company that I won't name right now. And my boss had told me that my job as a community manager was to make people love them, make people love the company. And that was my directive. And so I didn't have any kind of metrics other than, trying to figure out what love was supposed to be quantified as, and then working toward that. And it was completely overwhelming. And every single day I would show up and I just never knew if I was ever actually doing enough, because how do you measure and how do you actually know if you have created enough love from your customers? So my engagement goals were arbitrary, and growth and this love metric, which we never actually did figure out, I'll be totally honest with you, these were the main goals. And I was unable to articulate why that work mattered and why community mattered inside of the organization, because I couldn't step back from the day-to-day long enough to actually figure that out. And so I was really completely lost. I would show up to the office every day. I just felt uncertainty, overwhelm, rigidity, and I think more than anything else, a fear of becoming irrelevant. Because if I couldn't show that people were loving the brand more, on Friday than they did on Monday, which I couldn't, how would I ever know if my role was relevant to the organization? So this created a lack of boundaries, and I was exhausted and resentful. And I had to take my leave of that organization. Actually, 3 months in, my boss said, if you don't figure this out in 3 months, then you can just assume that this is the worst place to build community in the world. And then 3 months later, nothing had changed, nothing was getting better. And so I did leave, but I realized that it wasn't the worst place to build community ever. It was actually a very normal place to build community, because now that I've worked with hundreds of organizations, I see that happening over and over and over again. Just talented people completely lost. And so that was 8 years ago. I spent the next few years after that observing, interviewing, reflecting, experimenting, researching, just to figure out what were the underlying structures of community engagement, what were the dysfunctions that organizations perpetuate, and why do community managers constantly get in this place where they feel like they're lost, they're getting close to burnout. And I realized that it doesn't require burning out. It doesn't require becoming a martyr. It requires ruthless focus. Just focus on what really matters, what's really meaningful. And so that's when I started to look at not just creating engagement and love and other things that are impossible to measure, but actually creating meaningful engagement in online communities. So then I started to apply what I learned with the clients that I worked with and with the businesses that I worked with. And when I did that, I was able to create more conversations in the communities that I was helping to build. I was watching member numbers increase. And as Dennis mentioned, I was able to work on 2 different presidential campaigns, and my work has influenced the person who is currently in office actually being there, because the volunteer organization structure that was put in place, where they train people and then sent them out into the Zoom field, as it were, to do their work, was based on a lot of the principles that are in the book. So my clients were able to gain confidence, ask for promotions and raises, and their communities felt purposeful. But I think more than anything else, and this has been true in my life, is that what's really important is that they felt more calm and focused. Because if you feel calm, if you feel focused, you're going to do your best work as a community builder. If you instead feel like you're taking on other people's work, you don't know why you're there, you're much less likely to be able to create something sustainable and lasting. So let's begin talking about what real engagement looks like. So real engagement, meaningful engagement, these are synonymous, is the opposite of empty engagement. And this is what we see so much of on Facebook groups in many cases. There are certainly meaningful Facebook groups, but many Facebook groups are places where people just put a bunch of stuff that takes up time and brain space. So it's garnering attention, but it's not actually creating any meaning in people's lives. Or it might encourage shallow interaction. So if you think about people on Instagram posting about their wonderful vacations in Aruba during a pandemic and talking about how wonderful their lives are, that's the kind of shallow interaction that proliferates in many open social media spaces and in many online communities as well. So this is what happens. We end up focusing on empty engagement and engagement for engagement's sake when we don't take the time to be with the people that we're serving and get to know them more. And when I say be with them, that doesn't mean physically right now. It's obviously not a possibility, but simply sitting down, talking with them, interviewing them, and getting to know their actual needs and desires instead of just racing forward and following other companies' blueprints and things like that. What works for one company does not necessarily work for another. So I am also guilty of empty engagement. It's part of, it's part of what is so, we get so wrapped up in this empty engagement. It is so easy to measure empty engagement that it's very easy to fall into this trap. So in one of my organizations that I worked on prior in about 2013, for instance, I wanted to bring people together who loved books. And so that was my community. It was all about bringing readers together. And so each month I invited in a big name author. My CMO of the organization would interview them, and we gave away a ton of free food, free wine, and free books. So if I, as an outsider, saw, oh my gosh, people are giving out books, wine, and food, I would show up to this, right? It's not hard to get people to show up if you have food, wine, and books. The issue is that the things I was measuring around those events were things like how many people actually showed up, how many impressions of the hashtag were used on Twitter, the number of video views on YouTube after the event, and the conversion of the people who showed up from showing up into becoming paying members of our software product. And all of that was empty. And I know this now looking back on it because there was zero retention, zero between one event and the next. No one ever came back for more than one event. I guess the wine wasn't that good, number one. And two, it just was not knitting relationships. It was not helping people to meet one another. We often hope that that happens serendipitously, but if we don't engineer for it, it doesn't happen. And it certainly doesn't happen online unless we engineer it specifically for people to actually meet one another, to feel comfortable talking to one another, to create psychological safety. So if the entire purpose of those events was, let's say, a sales purpose or a marketing purpose, it would have maybe made sense to keep running those events. But because my job was to build an actual community, all of that was empty engagement. And empty engagement is the kind of thing that you measure through vanity metrics, as I mentioned. So here's an example of a Facebook group, has 94,000 members. Some brand, if this was theirs, they would probably put this number, on their press releases and talk about what an incredible community they have. But I think the heading of this group says it all, that many people have no idea what they're actually doing in certain Facebook groups. They're just there. And so just having this number of people in one room does not mean that there is meaningful engagement happening. Also looking at things like page views. These are page views from MySpace circa 2006. Looking at this, again, a vanity metric, if you're seeing the number increase, that obviously looks really good, especially if you're able to connect that to the page views on your community itself. But it's not a measure of meaningful engagement. And then this is an example of a community dashboard in some software that some of my clients have used. And this is another example of a dashboard that's filled with vanity metrics. So clicks, cheers, votes, comments, and shares, all of that is not going to tell you anything about meaningful engagement except what kind of attention you're getting. So are you getting people to click on things? Are you getting them to look at things? Great. What does that mean? Did they actually learn something? Did they actually meet someone through that process? So if I showed this to a CEO or a fellow business owner, this would tell people nothing about whether or not they should keep investing in the community. Really, these numbers they're meaningless without context. And so analytics like this and metrics are only helpful if they're actually useful in helping us determine whether or not we're actually creating meaningful engagement. So what is meaningful engagement? It furthers connection between your community members, or it furthers connection to your community's purpose, ideally both, and it helps to grow something durable, an actual durable, sustainable online community. So it's about connecting people to what I call the 2 Ps, which are people and purpose. If it's not connecting them to one or the other, then it is most likely empty engagement. So what are some meaningful engagement metrics? If we know that vanity metrics are going to steer us toward just simply getting more people to look at more things, what is a meaningful engagement metric? So some of the things that I look at with my clients include the number of connections that are happening within the online communities that I help run. So this is an example of month over month connections being made. And platforms, not every platform can enable this, but many platforms now can actually tell you how many people are having one-on-one conversations. You can't typically view the content of those messages. That's privacy issue. But you can see that, this many connections are happening each month, and you want that to rise. If people are actually talking to one another, you should also look at the moderation reports and things like that. If it's a bunch of harassment happening, that's not good. But if those connections are increasing, then you are doing something that's connecting people one-on-one. Next, you might look at things like activities. So this chart is showing how activity numbers are going up month over month. This month was not complete. That's why it's smaller. And what you want to see over time is that these yellow numbers here are increasing relative to the kind of pink salmon color here, because these are your admin or your moderators essentially. So over time in a sustainable online community, what you want is for your admins to do less and less of the creating work in your online community and have members be stepping up to create more self-sustaining structures. So if you're able to do that, then you can demonstrate people are stepping up, they're helping one another. It's not just the moderators or the admins having to do all the work. There's also a survey that has been validated called the Sense of Virtual Community Survey. It was created by Anita Blanchard at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and it breaks down not just what community means, but what community means virtually. And you can run this survey in your online community to understand if people feel belonging, if they feel support, and if they are actually getting the needs that they came there to the needs that they wanted to meet when they joined, to make sure they're actually meeting those needs. One of the big reasons why people leave online communities is because their expectations are not matching up with the experience in the community. So there are endless other metrics you can consider. This is just a sample of 6 more you might look at. But what's really important here to think about is just what is meaningful to you in your community and what you're building. So if you know what your purpose is, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you have questions about your community purpose, how can you show that people are actually, they're actually connecting to that purpose? How can you show that people are making progress toward that purpose? How can you show that as a community, you're making progress toward that purpose? And then how can you also show that people are making meaningful connections, knitting relationships, and coming together? So the other thing, if you don't have a fancy platform that lets you do, all of this kind of fancy stuff, like Facebook groups doesn't let you do a lot of analytics stuff on it, you can simply look and start looking at qualitative measures of connection. So this is just an email that I received from one of my online community students. And she simply said to me that I met so-and-so through your course, and she's been huge in the community growth of her community. And so thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and creating ties that bind. And so telling rich stories like this is another really important thing you can be looking at if it's not possible for you to get the kind of quantitative data that might indicate whether or not you're connecting people or connecting people to purpose. So as a review, empty engagement is the kind of content or kind of participation that creates a waste of time and energy, that commands attention but not connection. And meaningful engagement connects your people and connects the people to your purpose. And I invite you to consider your vanity metric triggers. This is something I actually look at them as triggers, much like trauma triggers, because they tend to play on our worst fears. We tend to gravitate toward looking at vanity metrics because we might be feeling insecure about our work. We might be feeling like our work is not relevant, that we feel some kind of ego threat. And that's when we tend to react by grasping for the nearest shiny piece of data that's easy to count. And so I know for myself that my vanity metric triggers are comparing myself to other people and seeing what they're doing. When I consume too much content that's about like hustle culture and, people bragging about how their companies have an 8 million member community, I highly doubt that for most people. They might have 8 million people who are users, but not necessarily a community. And then also when I'm not resting enough and when I forget what my purpose is. So I typically will have my purpose kind of printed out if I'm working on a client project, printed out on my wall at all times. So think about these for yourself because it's so easy to slip back into looking at vanity metrics when you're building an online community. So I just invite you at this point to define what meaningful engagement might mean in your community. You're probably not going to walk away from this right now, knowing the exact metrics to look at, but the 2 questions to ask yourself in order to figure out and define what meaningful engagement will mean for you is number 1, what is your galvanizing purpose? Or said differently, why do people bother to show up together? So does this connect people? Does your purpose actually move people to show up? And can you articulate it succinctly? If you can't, let's talk about that and get you a purpose statement that is much more easy to operationalize in your community. And then 2, how will this community help participants to become who they would like to be? So people must make progress in a community in order to actually continue to show up. If they're not making any progress, and sometimes that progress is not necessarily like, I'm going to become a professional chef. I'm a terrible cook right now, and I want to become a professional chef, and that's why I'm joining this community. Sometimes the progress is, I want to spend more time around people who like gaming the way that I do. And so making progress in that case might be something more like, I have more friends who are interested in what I'm interested in than ever before, and I feel connected to them. And so I feel more of a gamer today. So remember, for those of you, especially those of you who are just launching an online community right now, you don't have to post every single day. There is no ideal ratio of content or activity type, and you do not need to choose between relationships and business outcomes. This is a false dilemma that many people, especially executives at organizations, think you have to choose one or the other. Relationships that are sustained over time lead to business outcomes. It's not one or the other, it's both and. And at the end of the day, this is about relationships, not about checking off boxes, not about those vanity metrics. It's about actually knitting ties that bind. So I do have for you, I have a free download if you'd like to know. I have a whole tip sheet on how to actually, let's see, on 40 different online community engagement ideas that can help spark some engagement in your community today that is actually meaningful. So I will drop the link in the chat for you. And then, of course, it signs you up for my newsletter. You can unsubscribe if you'd like. And then from here, we can move into the Q&A.
That was great, Carrie. I guess one I answered at the very beginning that I don't have an online community, but silly me, I think this meetup group is an online community.
Yeah.
And I can't believe that went right over my head. Anyway, I think one thing that I've seen happen in this community that I wasn't expecting, but ever since it happened, I now try to observe for more of it, is 2 people connecting and one referring another to an opening at his or her company. So it's like creating the connections that are leading to jobs, which I think is super meaningful outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a meetup for people who care about and are passionate about content. So of course, that should lead naturally to making progress in your career and in your career goals. So yeah, there you go.
Okay,
Caroline has a question. She might have a few questions. So let's start with the first one.
Okay, hi Carrie. So I work for a tech company. My little startup just got bought by a bigger company, and as part of that, we're launching a community for developers. And I'll just say we're using the Mighty Networks platform. So we've done all this work. Like, what's your big purpose? We've taken our whole team. We've taken the masterclass. We've built all this. My question is, I literally just got off a call with some internal stakeholders, like our techie guys, our engineers, who we need them to do what you're saying, like make them do the work and build the content. And they were like, oh my God, really? Another place I have to go? I already go to GitHub, Slack, Stack Overflow, Twitter. I hate Facebook. Ew, it's Facebook. So like do you have any suggestions for overcoming that? Because we're going to go get our community, but like, if I don't have these internal guys, like I need them to buy in. So thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I'm curious to know, what is the purpose of the community and how is it different from like places like GitHub and Facebook groups that might be on the topic?
Well, do you want me to answer? I mean, it's one place where we can kind of put everything. Like, we're going to have trainings there. We're going to have engagement and people being able to ask questions, content, like all the blogs and things like that. So yeah, but there is duplication of other places. And I think that's the big challenge, but there isn't one place that has everything that we're going to have.
Right. So I think that's wonderful for your organization. My question, and the question that your members will have will be, that's great that the organization will have everything in one place. Why is that great for me? Just because you have them in one place. And so what the question that you might ask is, what is unique about having all of these things in one place, and what advantage does that give to the members of your online community? And that's how you can, if you can figure out the answer to that, then you can put the answer to that question to your engineers and say, this is why you don't want to necessarily be posting. This is why you can, these are the things you should post in GitHub. These are the kinds of things you should post here. And then you can create guidelines for them to say, you know, when you want to post something that's X, go to GitHub. Y, go here. Yeah, so that way it's clear to them, because there's so many channels, and the uncertainty of where to post is a big issue in general.
Okay, thanks.
I'll ask a quick question.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, Carrie, thanks for doing this. You know, the question really comes down to, where do you start? I hate to say it that way, you know, Facebook, LinkedIn, so on like that. And of course, it really does depend on the kind of community you're trying to reach. But let's just say you're trying to reach consumer versus B2B type stuff. Do you have any suggestions there? In my particular case, it's parents of school kids.
Yeah. Are you talking about the actual technology, or in terms of what work you should do first?
No, which platforms do you?
Okay.
How do you choose between the platform? I mean, there's so many you can start. You got Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn for the big three, in my opinion. Maybe some more are out there, but it's a challenge to just decide where to start.
Yeah,
I mean, one more. Do you start with blogging? Do you start with putting a topic and putting some value out there in a blog, and then base a community, try to get a community developing off that blog or that video?
Yeah, so you could do any of those things first. It's just a matter of where you want to start. What I will say is, there are, of course, your major social media platforms like Facebook. You can create Facebook groups. On Twitter, you can create hashtags, and that's how people can find each other. But there are, in addition to that, over 70 other community platforms that you can buy a license to, or that are open source, and you can grab the code and customize. So it's even more, that's a very complex question.
Can you give an example of that? 70, you can grab the code and create a customization?
Oh, I mean, like Discourse is one example. Vanilla forums. Trying to think of Platform OS is another one. There's so many. There's so many. So
do you recommend that for a starter?
I'm sorry?
You recommend that as a starting point, or do you get your momentum going with a big social platform, Facebook, you know, Twitter, LinkedIn?
So do you already have relationships with the people that you would like to gather?
A small group.
A small group. So
but, I mean, not enough that it would dictate one or the other. You know, everything's by email right now.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, honestly, if they're parents, you might ask which platforms they are comfortable with right now. One of the big things is, don't ask them which one they want to be on, because you will get all different answers, and you will let some portion of them down. But what you want to understand is, where are people already comfortable? Because if you're also asking them to learn a new technology in order to participate, that is a huge hurdle. And an organization can do that if they're like.
I just want to give you the first piece of feedback when I did that. I don't use Facebook. I hate Facebook. I don't use Twitter.
Don't use Facebook.
You mean just that? I mean, it's like, oh my God.
Yeah. I mean, and you asked me, like, should I start a blog? Should I do, you know, these things? Yeah, if you have content to write and you want to start a conversation around a blog, that is one starting place. What you want essentially is some way to start having conversations, and ideally some way to also start to gather people's emails so that you can stay in touch that way. Because then if you have people's emails, then in the future you could always move to another platform if you need to.
I have a follow-up question to that. So the newest buzz these days is Clubhouse app. Do you have any thoughts on that, and how effective that can be for a community?
Clubhouse. So I think there are certain communities that are doing really well there right now. There seems to be a huge movement around like VCs and entrepreneurial types of groups, as well as some of their language learning groups are fascinating. It has, in terms of like widespread adoption, it's pretty low right now. There's a very niche group of people that are on there. So I have a client that uses it right now. They're in the beauty industry, and they gather people who are executives in the beauty industry, and they have, the CEO of Sephora give a Clubhouse chat, and people join in and can ask questions. So I think it's great for if you want to start kind of a podcast that is more interactive. One thing to consider is that their moderation features and security features are not great. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. I think experiment with it. That could be another thing that you could try, Jim, is doing a Clubhouse chat and sending out an email and saying, meet me here at 10 a.m. on whatever day, and gathering people that way. So try it and see how it goes.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So Carrie, quick question. A bunch of folks on this meetup are building online communities. Are you taking on new clients?
Right now, I'm taking on clients starting in mid-April. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they can probably contact you from the link you shared. It looks like it has your contact information at the bottom, right?
Yes. Or I'm just C at carriemelissajones.com.
Okay.
Yeah. And I also have links if anyone wants an invite to Clubhouse. So me and Lenore can help you out.
Excellent.
Yeah. I think I have 8.
Excellent. It looks like Craig has a question. Craig, do you want to ask it? I see you typed it out. Okay.
Yeah, I think Quora was the one that really started the sort of, opposite of Facebook kind of thing of trying to have more focused communities and their model was invitations, and Clubhouse is really the latest one that's adopted that model to try to keep it more narrowly defined. Do you have any particular perspective on that? And then I also wondered about conversion and churn and things like that as metrics. Are those empty metrics, or are they meaningful metrics in your approach to this? And then the last thing is moderation. We're trying to build a networking community for freelancers right now. Actually, there's 4 of us working on this as a startup, all remotely. But we want to not have to have moderation involved in it. And our thinking is that if the communities are narrow enough, they're going to self-organize anyway. And so there isn't really a need for moderation. But I know Clubhouse is spending a fair amount of time on that.
Mm-hmm.
There was a good Sarah Perez article about, their moderation thinking of Telepath as well as another startup in this area a couple months ago. So anyway, sorry, those are like 3 questions. They're all sort of different.
Yeah, I wrote some of that down, so hopefully I remember all of your questions. So the first one was about moderation, or I'm sorry, the last one was about that. I will answer, I'll go in reverse order. So any community is going to need some form of moderation. There is no such thing as a self-managing online community. You might not need active moderation, escalation processes, and all of that on day one.
Yeah.
But you will need things like guidelines, or maybe it's just a very simple just structure for what happens if you violate the guidelines. And maybe you and the 4 people working on this, you are the moderators at this point. That's how I would deal with it. And it's not so much, it's depending on how large you get. At some point you will need more than that. But just to start out with, go there. Start with what you have, and then be thinking about long term. You can also, I don't know how the business model of your community will work, but have your members step up as moderators and train them.
Yeah.
That's a way to do that.
And what about conversion versus churn? Are those faux metrics or real metrics?
So it depends on your community's purpose. Some communities really want to grow. It's important to them that they grow because their purpose is, maybe it's to change. Let's look at like Black Lives Matter. If more people join that movement, the more likely it is for that movement to reach its goals. So in that case, you would want to look at things. I mean, this is not a great example because Black Lives Matter doesn't necessarily have a community platform, but imagine that it did. Okay. Yeah. You would want to look at things like churn, because if you're losing people who believe in this thing and are losing volunteers, maybe you're losing people who are leading marches, then you're not doing your job. And if you are not growing over time, then you're stagnating, and maybe your purpose needs to shift. Something about your strategy needs to shift. So in a case like that, which I would say is the vast majority of communities, do want to grow, and churn is an important consideration. So they're not necessarily, they're not meaningless metrics. Those are part of what I would look at. Those are not all I would look at, but I would include that in what I look at.
Okay, and invitational was the last thing, and actually Mighty Networks sort of is a variation on this, because you already have a community. Now you want to put it on a Mighty Network or whatever. But invitational in general as a model is something that a lot of communities are using. They've gotten pretty big. But my perspective is that sort of dies at a certain point. It can't get beyond a certain scale. Well, I'm just curious what your perspective is on invitational.
Yeah, again, it has to go to the purpose.
Yeah.
So if it's an exclusive group of people who don't want to grow very much, then sure, make it invitation only. I'm part of a small co-op, for instance.
Yeah.
And the people who are part of it, it's only invitation, like by invitation, can you be part of the co-op?
Okay.
You can't apply to join it. So there are cases where it makes sense, and then there are cases where it doesn't. What having the invitation and the exclusivity does is that it communicates that, like, this is something coveted that you might want to be part of. It can activate this this desire people have to be part of something that other people aren't necessarily part of, to be part of the in-group.
Right.
So it plays on some human motivation.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Good talk.
Great question.
So for a B2B company that has a lot of different audiences, sells into a lot of different verticals, a lot of different kind of roles that are involved in purchasing decisions, how would they, what's the best way to decide what kind of community to create? You know, what audience, how do we define our audience that we want to build a community around?
So it sounds like you want to create a community around customers. Is that right? Or prospects?
Customers and prospects. You know, only a small percentage would ever actually become, you know, expectation would be only a small percentage would ever actually become customers, but it'll just, you know, from the company perspective, just getting awareness and staying top of mind in that audience would be a goal.
Yeah. So I would just dig further into that company goal. Is it about staying top of mind? So is it about brand awareness in that case?
Mm-hmm.
If so, then you would want to create most likely something that's a lot larger. You could create a community with many different segments inside of it for people to ask things like sales questions and various questions about the actual experience. You could have customers in there asking questions, and then you could have the SEO value of having that information then be Googleable. So it just depends. My answer to all of this is it depends, and it usually depends on purpose. Depends on your member's purpose or your community's purpose or the organization's purpose. So in your case, it would be, what is the organization's number one issue right now that we think community can help us solve? And start with that versus starting and just randomly picking a group of people to gather. So I don't know if you have a sense of what that might be. But if you don't, then that would be a great place to start doing some discovery.
Well, yeah, I mean, it takes a company's, in this type of community, it would be a company's purpose, but you really have to figure out what's the community member's purpose for it to be at all compelling for that community member. So, yeah, and that could be the harder. That could be when you have diverse audiences, that could be the harder question to answer before you start. And with this when you talk about segmenting the community, all of a sudden the complexity just grows in the amount of work not astronomically, but it grows quite a bit. What should a company, what should you budget to create a community? You know, whether you outsource community management, you know, what kind of budget should you have, or how much time will it take internally if we do it, you know, all ourselves?
So you're going to need to budget for technology. Sometimes that's zero. If you build something on Facebook groups, for instance, you're going to need to budget for people resources. If you're, again, building something from scratch, you will need UX design. You will need probably some kind of user research resources, interview resources. You will need IT resources, because you'll need to hook up the systems to the other systems so that the data that you're getting from the community can then also work with data from your other systems. And you'll also need to think about yeah, so the technology, people, and then the actual potential resources you might need if you bring on external partners. So, so outside of your organizational resources, there are organizations. My technical partner that I work with is called Grazidi Interactive, and they do. You can outsource your management of the community to them. They will. They actually have designers and developers in house who do everything for you, and so that is going to depend on how complex your build is. They charge per hour. So it's like, I've seen organizations charge as little as $55 an hour up to over $600 an hour if you're going to go with more of a Khoros, Salesforce Community Cloud kind of option. So you're generally looking in year one, if you're a large organization, somewhere in the neighborhood of like between 2 and 500,000 for year one, and then costs go down from there.
Okay.
All right, I think that's all the time we have for questions. We're gonna do the book drawing. So first, before we finish the recording, Carrie, thanks so much for presenting to us today.
Yeah, you're welcome.